This thing's still on. Hey, it's Gavin Seim. Customers have been asking us for some more hands-on demonstrations of how the different module categories of Lumist works and how we can use those to best control the tone and the effects and the post-production in our images. Now, Lumist comes with a complete training video of how to use Lumist overall, but I thought we'd go in and break down a short video looking at each module. Of course, the start of Lumist is that we run that tonal map. The first thing we do is we just take those few top actions. We build the total map, and once we have that total map, we're able to see a map of all those tones, and then we can select and control and manipulate all those tones, but we also have the visual feedback of being able to see all those tones color-coded, and that alone is very powerful for helping us visualize and understand what's going on in the image. In fact, the total map and being able to see a map of all our tones was the foundational idea when we started to build Lumist to be able to give us that control. And then we just expanded and built off that to turn it into a system that took the idea and the control concepts of things like luminosity masks, but made them so much simpler, so much easier to use, and more versatile. But we've organized it into a few simple modules that kind of allow you to be self-guided through the process and allow an infinite number of combinations and effects. So if you've watched the complete Lumist training video, of course, you know that we start with the building of the total map. By building the total map, you get that total map overlay, you get the ability to select any of those zones. Next, we have tone select. This is where we built the total map, and now we can select any of those tones. And so these selections work whether the map is visible or whether it's hidden. It doesn't matter. It still has the information in there. And from here, we can deselect, we can select zones, and they're additive. So if we take, like, say, a zone 3 and then we select zone 4, now we've actually selected zone 3 and 4. And this is actually really powerful and something that lacks with a lot of other similar tools, because we have the ability to just select the range of tone that we want, and then we'll go down into these toolkits down below and be able to apply our modifications, our tone controls, and our effects to those. So the start of those is, of course, the simple toolbox. And we'll just get a little handsy with the simple toolbox here and dig into it. But what's really powerful here is these are very versatile in terms of applying fundamental things. So let's head over to the main machine here in the studio and let's take a look at each module in Lumist and see what we can do with it. I have the test image that comes with Loomis, and this is just the raw image with no map or anything on it. And that way you guys can take this image if you want to kind of follow along and play with this stuff and see it in this context. So we'll start with this one here. Now, if you haven't watched the initial Loomis training video, you should check that out because it gives an overview of how to use the map and all that kind of stuff. But just real quick, we're gonna go to the simple toolbox, but I just want to touch on the first two categories first. So the orange category up here, and bear in mind I am in button mode. Again, these are things you can see in the actions install video and the Loomis training video. So I'm in button mode, Loomis is loaded, I can scroll through and I can click any of these right now. The first thing I'm going to want to do, and this is the case anytime you want to use Lumist, for everything to work down here, we need the total map. So I'm just going to click the button and the total map is going to generate automatically on my image. There should be no dialogues, no nothing. So if you're getting that, you have some kind of an error somewhere and you can check our troubleshooting, or if you have a problem, you can always send us an email. But when everything's installed and working correctly, you click that total map, and Loomis just works. That's the beauty of it. Okay, now you have the map, and you'll see down here, we have a group of layers that represents the map. So you're seeing all the tonal range, right? You're seeing the zone scale corresponded to all the color coding. So you kind of got this false color overlay that also works with zones. So the more you understand what you're looking at right here, the more you see these zones. You know, we see a little clipping here. Here's our zone 8s. Right down here's our zone 2s, 3s, 1s, etc., right? You can actually learn about your zones, and then you can apply that to shooting in camera, because zones are absolutely something you want to be using in camera. Now, if you want to learn more about zones, if you're not that familiar with using zones with digital, check out our Exposed workshop, which is a 4-hour series on exposure that goes in depth with zones. And the cool thing, and one of the things we have done with Lumist, is we've taken the image making in camera, the use of zones, and it crosses over perfectly to what you're going to be doing here in post-production. So just a quick recap of the opening actions. I can refresh the total map, build the total map. So I would use refresh after I've edited it if I want to see the latest version of the map. I can show the map, hide the map. And the cool thing is whether the map is shown or hidden, all the functions of Lumist are still going to work. I can also delete the map. There's a button in here for that, because Lumist actually has some locked layers and stuff to keep things from getting messed up and to make everything work fluidly. So if you want to get rid of the map, just kind of click that delete map button so you don't have to go through and manually unlock those layers. Just saves you some time. Okay, so basics right here. You're starting at the top. You've built your map. Now you're going to go down, and here's your tone select. And this is pretty straightforward in that we can select any of these tones. And you'll see as we select, it's additive. So I select one tone, right? Let me just deselect and start that over. I'm going to select zone 9. I'm going to select zone 8. And we see we're adding together. So there's no hassle. There's no shortcut keys you have to do. You click a zone, you select it. You click another zone, it adds it. And now you're seeing this selection, and you're actually seeing the selection in context with this preview. So the green dotted area is actually representative of your current selection. So I can go through and select whatever I want. And instead of just the marching ants, I now see the green dotted area. Of course, I can deselect all. It's best to use the buttons, the quick buttons here. You can go into the layers and manually turn things on and off and things like that. But by and large, we've really designed Loomis to just be fluid and simple. Now let's talk about a couple things. So let's say I select zone 8 and 9 and I want to work with those. Now we come down to the simple toolbox. Okay, the simple toolbox looks simple, but you can do an incredible amount with this. And I think sometimes when people get into Loomis, they underestimate this. These first 3 colors here, okay, excluding the effects that we're seeing down here, which we'll get into later. We're going to do an in-depth on those as well. But just with the total map, the selections, and the simple toolbox, you basically have everything that you would do with something like luminosity masks, but way simpler, way more visual, and connected to the zone system directly in terms of foundationally how it was built, okay? So from here to here, just through there, you essentially have luminosity masking. Then you could take it even further when we start adding the other effects and actions, and we'll get into those in other videos. But what I'm going to do to start with is we're just going to deal with selections and with the simple toolbox. So what can we do now that we have a selection, right? I see I have a selection made. I'm going to actually deselect all. And again, by using the buttons up here in tone select and using the deselect all, I'm actually automatically hiding the mask previews and all that stuff. Sure, I could just Command D to deselect, but to have everything keep working fluidly in Lumist, just use the buttons. It's going to save you a lot of time, and it's going to allow those visual cues and feedback and everything to work very fluidly. The cool thing about Loomis is everything we do, we're not going to be altering our foundation, right? It leaves the base layer, and we just keep building. Just like all Seim actions, we just build. It's kind of an upward workflow. And so we start with this base image, and then we just keep adding stuff to that, and it literally gives us infinite amount of things we can do. Okay, so let's say that I just wanted to add a little punch to all of this, right? Let's say I didn't have any of the other actions, and I was just working with Lumist and the simple toolbox. Okay, so I could simply do a perfect punch, let's say. Add a little bit of punch. Now, what's happened? I've just run this action with no selection made, right? The action works fine with no selection. If I run an action like this, and most of the actions in Loomis are this way, if I run an action with no selection, it just runs it globally to the entire image, and I don't have to worry about it, okay? So think about that first. I just ran the perfect punch. It gave me this group here that had these different layer masks over the top, and it gave me this effect. I had no selection made. Now, let's say I wanted to limit this to a selection retroactively. And this is beautiful. People don't realize this a lot of times about Loomis, because you can take any layer that you've applied manually, any other action you've run from another set, and as long as you've run the total map, you can then select that layer and apply a mask to it. So right now, there's no mask to this group right here, okay? But let's say I wanted to limit that to the lower zone. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But I'm going to leave the highs and the lows alone so I don't have any clipping. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and feather this. Okay, because remember, we have a hard edge right here, and if we just mask it like that, we're going to have a hard edge. So I'm going to feather once, And you can click this as many times as you want. And I'm seeing this preview in real time. Let me feather 25 again. So now I've feathered 50. I'm going to do it one more time. A real nice soft feather. Okay. But what can I do with this? Well, I'm going to select the layer that I want to alter right here. Okay. And I'm just going to mask away the non-selected. So I'm going to click it. Okay, now you can see if you look at our layer mask, it actually updated a layer mask there with the selection I had made, okay? And so you see now I'm not affecting those highlights. I'm only affecting the mid to low ranges that I selected. You can select with tone select when you're using simple toolbox, or you cannot, okay? So now let's do it the other way, right? This way we applied it, then we retroactively applied a mask to that based on a selection that we made. Now I can do the same thing by selecting first. Another thing I can do is if let's say I had some banding or I had an issue with this where the lines weren't hard enough. In fact, let me actually show you this so you can kind of see what's what. So let me just take these and make some selections again. So I'll just take this range of selections right here. And I'm not going to feather it this time. Now if I mask away non-selected again, it's actually going to delete the current mask on the layer I have selected right here, okay? And it's going to update it. So I'm just going to mask away non-selected. But now you'll notice that I have some harder lines. And sometimes this might be fine, and other times it might totally screw you up. But if you were to look up in the sky and stuff here, you'd see some harder lines. So we can actually go back retroactively. Now I could say blur current mask, okay? So we have feather, which is how we feather our selection, but we have feather and expand, which feathers even more and expands the selection a little bit to compensate. Then we have blur current mask. What this is going to do is take the mask on the current layer and soften it. Again, just like the feather command, I can click that as many times as I want, and we're actually getting a softer and softer selection. So now we've got this little bit of snap added, right? And we're still just in simple toolbox. But let's say we want to start doing some dynamic range things. So let's take zone 9 and 10. Okay, we're going to take those highlights, and I'm going to feather and expand. So I kind of reach out a little bit beyond that. And I'm going to do a darken curve. Okay, so again, I'm only selecting. Look what's happening here. I'm only darkening down this area right here in the sky, bringing back some of those highlights, okay? Let's do a magic saturate globally, bring a little more color into this. Now it's starting to look a little poppy. Now, of course, just like anything else, right? Any layer we can apply a tone select to, whether it's from Lumist or not. So understand that with the simple toolbox, it extends way beyond Loomis, and this is something that is really powerful. Because let's say now I say, all right, I want to do something manually, right? Let's say I want to do something that's not in the simple toolbox. I want to go down here and I want to do a photo filter. So I'm going to add a photo filter adjustment layer on top, and I'm going to go up here and I'm going to add a little bit of a warming filter. Let's not do too much, but okay, a little bit of warming filter. But now I say, well, I want to limit this. I say maybe I don't want this in every layer. So I'm going to say 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, right? I'm going to only apply this photo filter. I'm going to limit it now to the highlights. Let me feather this a little bit. Now I'm going to mask away non-selected. So I want to make sure the layer that I want to alter is selected. It doesn't have to be the mask selected, just as long as that layer is selected. And I'll just click the mask away non-selected, and it's going to update that mask right here. And you'll see that now that warming is only being applied to that range of zones that I selected. So again, really important to remember, this kind of stuff you can do with anything. Okay, let's make another selection. Let's take our shadows. So let's take 0, 1, and 2, right? I'm going to feather those, okay? And let's do a lighten curve. Boom. Right at the top, it just put a lighten curve. And I have that right here. Now, we might say, well, that's a bit extreme, right? We're kind of getting that HDR-ish kind of look, but it might be a little too much. The beauty of Lumist is it's meant to give you selective control, to give you workflow, but then to keep you completely fluid in your ongoing edit. So you'll see we've got this upwards progressive workflow, okay? We just keep adding layers, and any of these can be turned on and off. We can adjust opacity on any of these, so we can manually interact with any of these layers exactly as we would when we normally work in Photoshop. We just have this added toolbox of luminosity control as well as effects. which we'll get to later. But bear in mind, we haven't even left the simple toolbox and the basic selections. Okay, so now I might say this is too much. I can just click on this, and I can go up here to the properties of my layer mask, and I can edit it, right, and do whatever I want with it to keep the visual feel of it exactly where I want it to be. Okay, and so I can do whatever I want with this layer. Now, another thing we can do is we can take a current layer that has a mask that we've applied it to and say, I want to do something different. Rather than have to go make a selection again, we can use the delete layer and restore selection mask. So all I would have to do is click this, making sure again that the layer I want to modify is selected. It would delete that layer and restore the selection that I had based on that layer, and then I could do something else like exposure up, for example, instead of that curves layer, okay? So remember that you can control almost anything in terms of the mask, adding the masks, the selections, all that kind of stuff in here. And then you can go over down here and still have all control of the layers and the layer masks, the layer effects and all that kind of stuff, opacity, everything, right? So don't feel locked in. Don't feel like Lumist is like saying, here's your toolkit, you have to just work with this. No, I can take any layer like we did with the photo filter. I can apply any levels or any curves layer, then I can come back up here, make a selection, and apply that selection to here, okay? Now, I could also use the simple toolbox without making the selection here. So let's say I made a manual selection. Okay, so let's say I have a photo filter. Let's do that again because it's easy. Now this is probably going to be ugly, but I'm going to crank this up so you can see it, right? So I got this photo filter and I've turned it way up, all right? Let's say I manually made a selection for whatever reason. Okay, so I'm going to take and I'll just do a lasso and I'm going to manually select this right here. Just really cruddy, right? Now I can still use the feather, so I can still feather that selection. And in fact, here's the beauty. I didn't make a selection here, but as soon as I clicked the feather in the simple toolbox, it recognized the selection that I had made and now introduced the normal previews that we'll see. So now it's actually interacting with the selection that I had made. Okay, so I'm feathering, it's showing me this, and I can of course say, let's select that photo filter, and again, mask away the non-selected, so it's only selected to where I apply it. So you're not even limited to selections based in tone select. Tone select is all about giving you immediate, instantaneous control over those zones, but you can use all these features, guys, with your own selection. I'm just going to delete that photo filter layer because it's a little bit over the top. Okay, so I can go in here and just do specifics to anything I want. I could say, well, hey, let's lighten this area up around here a little bit, and let's feather and expand so it's nice and soft. I'll see a preview, and I'll put a lighten curve there, right? And so I put a little bit of a spotlight on him over there. Now I might dial the opacity of that down, and I could continue to even smooth that feathering down more by clicking the blur current mask a couple times, which is again going to soften the edges even more. Just like that. And so I can make manual selections and apply tools from the simple toolbox. I can make zone selections from tone select, which is typically how I'm going to be working. Anything I do, I have complete control over. So for example, let's say I wanted to apply a vignette. I could also do that without any hassle, right? I could make a selection here, kind of select everything but the edges, right? Or I could do a manual one. Makes really short work of things like vignettes. Okay, so I'm going to feather it a couple times, make it nice and soft. I see the preview for what I'm going to be working for, and now I can do a darken curve, and boom, I've just added a vignette. But what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? Well, this is sometimes what happens when I do the selections myself instead of just using Lumist. I darkened the center because I selected the center, okay, instead of selecting the outside edges because I didn't select inverse. Now check this out. All I have to do is I'm going to use the delete layer and restore selection. So I'm deleting my darkening curve and bringing my selection back. Now I'm going to do a select inverse, okay? I did a select inverse, and now I'm going to do that darken curve again, bring that layer back, and now I've just put that darken curve where I want it. I can adjust opacity. I can feather it more using the blur current mask. All of this stuff is infinite. So everything in Loomis is interacting with what you have in your layers palette, whatever that may be. The only limitation being that for a lot of effects in Loomis, you need to make sure that the total map exists somewhere. Even if I'm not using the total map right now, right? I haven't refreshed in a while, and let's do that. Well, let's bring the total map to the top. Okay, so I'm going to refresh my total map. For the selections and things like that, zone selections, the total map needs to be present because that's the back end that it needs. Now you can see how the dynamics have changed. We no longer have that pure clipping into zone 10. We have some in the zone 10, but we don't have that high 20%, which is like the pure white. So we've recovered a lot of that. We've brought some shadow in. Let's go ahead and hide the map and see what we're looking at. Now listen, I know we haven't done a ton to this image. We haven't done any glamorous over-the-top effects, and yet, let's actually look at the effects we've added just sitting here playing. We've changed this image dramatically just going through and just manipulating tones and things that are in Photoshop and using those existing features. So what did we miss? Let me make sure I didn't overlook anything. Top layer from current state. Let's just go through a couple of the other actions we may not have talked about. Again, very useful. Let's say you've been working for a while, but you want a top layer representing all your work. Because remember, as you're building actions, and this is the case with any well-designed actions, it's not necessarily modifying everything, right? I mean, the darken curve that I'm using here and the lighten curve I'm using here, these are layer masks. They're not actually hard layers, which allows them to be infinitely adjustable. But let's say you need a destructive layer because you want to burn and dodge, or you want to do some cloning or something like that, right? You can just click top layer from current state, and at the very top, it's going to give you a merged layer. Now, bear in mind, from this point up, as you add stuff, that merged layer becomes kind of your foundation unless you turn it off, okay? But again, we're doing that upwards arching workflow. We just keep working up and everything's controllable. We could go back and flatten this, of course, but the way we design the actions here, there's no need to flatten. There's no need to worry about any of that unless you want to do it at the end to save file space. So you can always go back. You can always say, well, what have I done, right? Do I want to take something off? Have I gone too far? So here's that merged layer. We could then continue building up. Now, a lot of the other actions you'll see in Simple Toolbox are just simple effects. Perfect punch, right? And we've ran that one before. It's getting to be a little overkill right now. And that's just some saturation, some curves, some levels. These are just generic functional actions, right? The curves, lighten curve, darken curve, pretty self-explanatory. Just remember that once you apply those curves, you can then modify them however you need to. And of course, if you apply them without any selection, they'll just apply globally as if you would just run a generic workflow action. And so I'm deleting some of these as I go along. Exposure up, exposure down, same thing, right? We've tried to find a happy medium, but let's say you make a selection and you say, hey, let's take the zone 10s and the zone 9s and the zone 8s, and let's drop the exposure a little bit. Boom, I'm just going to do that exposure down. Now, I didn't feather it, so I got kind of some hard edges. I'm going to come back here. I'm going to blur the current mask, okay? But here's the thing. This was exposure 33, but this is an adjustment layer. So I could still go up here to the regular adjustment layer settings, and I could tweak this as much or as little as I wanted to in any direction. But for now, I'm just going to leave it alone, okay? Blank levels layer. Again, same thing, except for this one doesn't do anything. So it takes whatever your current selection or non-selection is, and it just makes a levels layer. You can see nothing's changed here. It's just giving me a blank layer that I can work with without having to manually go down here. Just some quick time savers. Blank curves layer. Mask away non-selected. We've used a lot of that. Make a masked group. Now this can be useful. Let's say I've selected a zone, okay? And I'm gonna feather it, and I'm gonna make a mask group. So what this does is it puts at the top a group with all this stuff in it. And now anything I drop into this group is going to be masked to whatever that group is masked to. Now you can see there's actually a current merge state too. This is the flat layer, kind of like the top layer from current state is already in that group in case you need it, but it's turned off by default. So if you're making a group and you're going to drop like adjustment layers into it, right? Because now it's already masked. Now I could say, well, let's do curves, let's do levels, let's do exposure, right? Let's do these different layers, but they're only going to apply to what my master group has been masked to. So I can add anything I want to this group and mask it. And I could do the same with this merge layer if I wanted to do some destructive edits. So again, very cool controls with that. Blur the current mask, we've looked at that. Feather and expand, feather 25. Again, these are additive, right? You can click feather 25 4 times and you've got a 100 pixel feather. Very quick modular controls. That's what we're going to see as we go through Lumist. And this kind of gives you the basics, right? And you can see that we have done a lot. Let's just group all these together so we can just kind of turn them on and off. We've done a lot to this image without even going into the color painters or the one-clicks or any special effects. This was just all basic tone control stuff using our own selections, using tone selections, whatever we want. So we just took the first couple of modules of Loomis, put them to work to give us total control over luminosity, total control over those zones, manual control that we can apply to our selections. It's just an incredible workflow kit, guys. And I hope that this helps you kind of understand what you can do. If you have more questions, let me know. But I think this has been a pretty extensive overview. We've basically covered every action in the simple toolbox, from feathering to masking those groups, and then to the basic effects like curves, exposure, magic saturate, perfect punch, just some general use stuff. And you may see this expand a little bit in the future, but you can always rely on simple toolbox to be not over the top stuff. Now remember that Loomis is about giving you simple control. Never feel limited with Loomis. So let's say, we're making selections, we're masking, we're doing all this stuff, right? But because it's retaining, just like our other action sets do, everything's being retained in terms of your layers, your masks. You can go in and use regular Photoshop principles to adjust things. So let's say, for example, you make a zone selection in Lumist, right? And you have something like perfect punch. And so you've made this selection, but you're noticing that up here in this corner, hey, it's darkening it up a bit much, right? I don't quite like the selection. All you have to do is click that layer mask, and you can still just modify that layer mask. So I'm gonna hit B, go to the brush tool, and remember that white reveals, black conceals. So if I paint black, let me turn my opacity up. If I paint black, I'm actually going to hide the mask up in this corner. So I'm just using a nice soft brush, and I'm manually modifying this. I could do the same thing. Remember, we added that vignette, but I could be like, well, on this right side of the sky, that vignette doesn't make a lot of sense. So I'll just brush it away, right? I'm selecting the mask. That's how a mask works. So if I select the mask part of the layer, this little thing to the right, or in the case of an adjustment layer, it's basically all that's there. I select that mask and I paint in black to hide it, or I can hit the X key and paint in white to bring it back, right? White reveals, black conceals. So now I'm bringing back a little bit of that. So I've kind of like cut the corner out of that vignette. And I could do that more. I could do it as much as I wanted to. But you see what I'm getting at here. You have all of the control. Loomis is taking things that are in Photoshop, and it's combining it with a toolkit of being able to select zones, being able to see zones visually. So we're really adding features that don't exist in Photoshop, but we're fluidly combining those with the way that you already use Photoshop, or the way that you should already use Photoshop, that you'll want to learn to use Photoshop if you're new to Photoshop. And all that control, all that layers, all that masks, it's all right over here. And unlike an editor like Lightroom or something like that, where it's a single global edit, right? If you adjust exposure, it adjusts exposure. Whereas in Photoshop, if you make a layer that adjusts something like exposure, and then you add another layer that adjusts it again, everything's additive. But because it's all in layers, you have perfect control over all of that. We're just getting started. Stay tuned for the other videos. We're going to get into how we can take this further now and apply it with the painters, with the one-clicks. And then we're just going to get into some nitty-gritty of how to really refine our images, and how Loomis can help us every step of that way, every step of that journey, while keeping us in total control of the image. So I'm actually going to save this so that we can come back to it. And we may try some new images. We may just keep working on this one just so we have consistency, because I know that can be good when we're learning, even though it's not quite as exciting. We're not seeing quite as many images. Okay, hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know if you have any questions. Of course, if you don't have Lumist, you can find it over at seimeffects.com, and you can always email me from there with any questions. The simple toolbox is the fundamental tools, but it's an incredibly powerful set for tone control. And I really want to encourage us all to take time with tone. It's one of the least understood and least utilized elements of photography. And one of the most powerful things about Lumist is that we can make these selections, and we can use Simple Toolbox to do things like controlling dynamic range in an incredibly powerful way, because we can say, hey, let's take the dark ranges. Let's take zone 1, 2, and 3, right? And let's lighten those a little bit. But let's take zone 7, 8, and 9, and we're gonna bring that down a little bit. So we have this lateral control that can be applied at any time.